Hello, and welcome to GBE Business Digest. In today's episode, we're diving into USMCA, Chapter 22. Let's get started.
Ever get curious about, the hidden forces that kind of shape the global marketplace? We're diving into a chapter from a recent trade agreement today, and let me tell you, it's a bit of a hidden gem. We're tackling Chapter 22, State-Owned Enterprises and Designated Monopolies. Now, I know what you're thinking. Sounds thrilling. But trust me, this isn't just some dry legal jargon. This chapter gives us a peek behind the curtain at how governments can use their own companies to influence global trade. And the ripple effects, they might surprise you. So we're talking about state-owned enterprises, those big players like national airlines or energy companies where the government holds a controlling stake. And then there are designated monopolies. Think your internet provider if they were the only game in town, with the government stamp of approval. We encounter these companies all the time as consumers, but this chapter makes you wonder, what are the rules of the game? And that's where things get interesting. The document dives into this balancing act of commercial considerations versus non-commercial assistance. Like they're trying to say, okay, governments, you can have your hands in the cookie jar, but you can't just eat all the cookies. I was struck by how specific the chapter gets. For instance, it calls out things like debt-to-equity swaps as a form of non-commercial assistance. That really piqued my curiosity. To help us unpack all of this, I've got an expert joining us who can shed light on what these rules really mean in practice.
What's fascinating about these debt-to-equity swaps is they can be a way for governments to provide financial support to their companies without directly handing over cash. It's like a kind of financial maneuvering that can be difficult to track.
And difficult to regulate, I imagine.
Exactly. This is where the whole concept of adverse effects comes into play. The chapter stresses that state-owned enterprises shouldn't be used in a way that harms companies from other countries, but who decides what crosses the line? It's a bit of a gray area.
Right. Feels like one country's strategic investment could be another country's unfair competition. So with all this potential for a global game of economic chess, why do governments even bother getting involved in business in the first place?
Well, it's a complex question, and there are a few common motivations. Sometimes it's about national security, ensuring control over vital resources like energy or defense. Other times it's about propping up industries deemed strategically important to a country's economy, even if they might not be commercially viable on their own.
Makes sense. So we've got governments juggling national interest, economic growth, maybe even a bit of global power play. But how do these rules we're discussing tucked away in this trade agreement actually attempt to create a level playing field?
A key concept here is transparency. The chapter stresses that governments should be more open about their state-owned enterprises, who owns them, how they operate their financial dealings. It even suggests setting up a committee to oversee all of this. It's an attempt to shine a light on companies that often operate in the shadows.
Sunlight being the best disinfectant, as they say. But what about enforcement? If a country bends the rules to give their state-owned enterprises an advantage, what's to stop them?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The agreement lays out a framework, but it ultimately relies on countries holding each other accountable. And as you can imagine, with so much at stake economically and politically, that doesn't always happen smoothly.
It sounds like these agreements are more like guidelines than hard and fast rules.
In a way, yes. Which is why the chapter's emphasis on future negotiations caught my eye. It recognizes that these rules will need to adapt as the global economy evolves and new challenges emerge. It's acknowledging that this is an ongoing conversation, not a one-time fix.
I find that rather reassuring, actually. It suggests a willingness to adapt and find solutions as the global marketplace changes.
Absolutely. It highlights that international trade isn't a static system. It's constantly evolving. And these agreements are an attempt to establish a framework for cooperation and hopefully prevent things from getting too far out of hand.
Speaking of evolving, another interesting point in the chapter is how it focuses specifically on activities that affect trade or investment above a certain financial threshold. So smaller players get a pass.
It does seem that way. And practically speaking, trying to monitor every single transaction involving state-owned enterprises would be nearly impossible. This way, the focus is on the bigger players, those with the potential to significantly disrupt the market.
The ones that could trigger those adverse effects we were talking about earlier.
Precisely. It's about prioritizing and focusing on the areas where the potential for harm is greatest.
This is all so fascinating. It really makes you realize how interconnected the global economy truly is. It really does. It makes you think about the companies we interact with every day as consumers. Do we even realize, when we're dealing with a state-owned enterprise? And does it matter?
Those are the big questions, aren't they? I'd say it's probably more often than we realize. Think about like the electronics we buy, the hotels we book, even the gas we put in our cars. Many of these industries have major state-owned players. Whether it matters depends on how these companies are managed and regulated, which is what makes this chapter so relevant.
It's like this hidden layer of rules shaping the global marketplace.
Yeah.
Right under our noses.
Exactly. We often focus on the brands and products, but the ownership structures and the rules governing those structures can have a huge impact on competition, pricing, even innovation.
This deep dive has been eye-opening. Who knew a single chapter on state-owned enterprises could be so thought-provoking? It's clear that these companies play a significant role in the global economy, and understanding the rules governing them is crucial for anyone who wants to navigate the complexities of international trade. If this peek behind the curtain has you curious, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Head over to our social media and share your aha moments using #DeepDiveSOE. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive. Until then, happy learning.
Thank you for listening to this episode of GBE Business Digest. If you found this information useful and would like to stay updated with the latest business insights, make sure to subscribe, activate the bell, and visit the Carlos Bastida website to explore his portfolio of services. The link is in the description. Let's work together to take your business to the next level.